So, race and ethnicity are sometimes conflated, but they're different. Race can be defined as a grouping based on shared physical traits, ancestry, genetics, social relations, and the relationship between those groups.
Examples of racial categories common to the United States include Indigenous American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian or Asian American, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, and white.
Sometimes people refer to Caucasian as a race instead of white. Did y'all know that the term Caucasian was first introduced as a racial category in the 1780s and was most notably used by Johann Friedrich Blumenbach in 1795 to refer to the inhabitants of the Caucasus region? Blumenbach believed those in that region represented the ideal form of humanity.
Yes, Blumenbach went on to assign additional racial labels with the idea that these groups were physically or mentally inferior. This included the categorization of Africans, excluding light skinned North Africans as Ethiopian. He also assigned non Europeans in Japan and China as Mongolian. Indigenous Australians and Pacific Islanders were assigned as Malayan, and those indigenous to what is now the North America were labeled as the red race.
So we wouldn't dare refer to everyone of African descent as Ethiopian, those indigenous to North America as red, those of Asian descent as Mongolian, or those indigenous to Australia and the Pacific Islands as Malayan.
And for those very reasons, and the fact that these racial groups and these racial labels are outdated and born out of white supremacy ideologies, it is inappropriate and geographically inaccurate to refer to all of those of European descent as Caucasian. In the US context, white is the most appropriate.
So now that we've spent some time unpacking race, let's move on to ethnicity. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes people use race and ethnicity interchangeably, but they're not the same.
Right, ethnicity describes cultural factors, some of which are nationality, regional culture, ancestry, and language. People living in the US represent many different ethnicities, but the ethnicity that we see on many government forms is Hispanic, Latino, Spanish origin. However, in this, we utilize Latinx because it's an inclusive of non binary folks and those who identify as gender fluid.
Latinx can represent those of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South and Central American descent, and other nationalities and regions in Latin America, regardless of race. So it is important to note that someone can identify with an ethnicity, but that ethnicity does not predict race.
That is such an important distinction, Rosemary. Continuing with that example of Latinx as an ethnicity, individuals can identify ethnically as Latinx or Latino or Latina, and also identify racially as white, Black, triracial, biracial, indigenous, Taino, or any other race. But as Greg mentioned earlier, there are many ethnicities in the US.
Yeah, some of the other examples are Arab, Caribbean, Gullah, Irish, Jewish, Korean, Middle Eastern, and North African, South Asian. There are so many, many more.
The complexity in race and ethnicity makes me think about the ways that our various social identities come together and represent our joint membership in two or more social identity groups.
And while that describes intersecting identities, there is another word, intersectionality. This word is used to describe the interactions between our social identities with societal power and privilege. Intersectionality describes the way in which race, class, gender, and other aspects of our identity overlap to form unique occurrences of interpersonal and systemic discrimination and oppression.
Intersectionality was first coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, an attorney, professor, and scholar. Crenshaw first used this term to describe how Black women were experiencing workplace discrimination that could be attributed to both their gender and their race. She argued that employers could not determine if they were treating Black women fairly by comparing them to examples of fair treatment of white women or Black men, because the oppression that Black women experienced from the combination of both their gender and their race was unique based on the overlapping layers of oppression.
We want to point out that much of what we shared defines words as we use them. Language has and will always continue to evolve and carry different meanings for different people. It is always essential to understand more than a word's definition, but its history and its significance as well. Thanks for listening. Please check out our other installments of anti-racism and anti-oppression terminology. To suggest a term, please email us at ile@umaryland.edu.